Good morning, and to our friends joining us abroad, good evening. Welcome to Mirage Talks. Today, we welcome Dr. Rebecca Weintraub. She is a coach and speaker in communication to touch on the topic Incredible Communication, Uncover the Invaluable Art of Selling Yourself. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started.
Thank you ever so much. And I will apologize, even though you should never apologize, for some odd things happening with my video. We're at our vacation home in the mountains, and sometimes it doesn't always work. But I'm going to talk to you today about communication. If you read my video, if you read my bio, you saw that in between academic gigs, I worked at a company called Hughes Aircraft, became Hughes Electronics, not my fault, but it was a very big aerospace company. And aerospace companies, I think this is true all over the world, but it's definitely true in the United States, have a lot of PhDs, and they're usually in things like astrophysics and electrical engineering and all sorts of science classes that I never took. But I had just gotten my PhD and I was pretty proud, and I was working with one of the premier scientists who was part of the creation of geosynchronous communication satellites. And so he said to me, "I understand you have a PhD." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What is it in?" And I said, "Communication." And he said, "Radio frequency or microwave?" Now, he actually said RF. I had to go find out what RF stood for. And I thought microwaves cooked. I didn't know they communicated. Well, it turns out, and when I said human communication, he looked at me and said, "They give a PhD in that?" Which is when I realized that at Hughes, human beings interfaced. Computers and satellites and antenna all communicated. So we're going to talk about human communication today, and what we think is one of the most critical elements of your personal communication effectiveness, which is your credibility. And so the book that we have written with my partner, Stephen Lewis, is divided into basically two parts. I'm sorry, three parts. We have a communication assessment, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why it's a little different than most communication assessments, because it's not skill-based. Then I'm going to talk about our foundational concepts, which are the contextual glue that our actual communication takes place within. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the practice doing this, as I call it, areas. But what I'd like you to do is jump in with questions or comments, or even better, pushback. As we go through this, it'll be much more interesting. And for those of you who are abroad, might help keep you awake. So let me begin by talking about the assessment, because we do that at the beginning of the book. One of the things that's really important around our communication is kind of understanding ourselves. And what we think is particularly important is looking at the elements that go into communication. And a lot of this is presentation based, because decisions are made around tables today, conference tables. They are not made on the basis of memos, of white papers. I'm really old, so back in the day, I wrote a lot of white papers arguing for why I needed the budget increased and such. Okay, they don't do that anymore. You sit around a conference table, somebody makes a presentation, you discuss it, and your ability to present your arguments and your point of view, is make or break time. So we look at first, how do you convey information? So are you direct? You go pretty much straight to the point. Those are people that we talk about who are, straight talkers, bottom line, things like that. Or are you diplomatic, where you're sensitive to what's going on around other people? You are a little more conscious of what's going on in the room, and you try to adjust your remarks so that people are more likely to relax into your point rather than be driven into some kind of confrontation. The next kind is, how do you receive information? Are you looking for the content, not really paying attention much to the other elements that go on? What's happening, if you will, on the people side? You're really focusing on the details, the facts, the figures, and such like that. Or are you relational, which means that you are very empathetic to what the other person is saying? You're thinking about how your remarks may affect them. The danger in that one is that you cut your own authority because you are not taking your own point of view forward. The next level is, how do you prepare information? Are you meticulous? You're organized, you're looking for all of the data, you are very much into the details. Or are you what we call holistic? You're the big picture thinker. You're looking at it from all of the potential areas that might go on. The little details you think are less critical. The holistic people are the quintessential wingers, because they have their bigger idea and they can go in and they can talk about it. They're not coming in with lots of facts and figures. My writing partner, meticulous. Weintraub, holistic. And we kind of knew that going in, but as we got deeper and deeper into the context and the contents of the book, and we're working on this particular kind of assessment, we started to realize some very interesting things about us. And I'm going to tell you this because I suspect examples like this exist in your own life. So we're now working on our second book. So when we need to talk about a concept or an approach or whatever, we either get together. Now we can get together in person. When we wrote this entire book on Zoom, we met in February, early March of 2020, and we didn't sit down together in the same zip code until May of 2021, when the book had been turned into our editor. So you can do things via Zoom, but who knew? So what we do is we get together and I talk, because I think by speaking. That's what holistic people do. And Stephen takes copious notes. Then he goes away and he thinks about it. And then a day or two later, we get back together. He's processed it. He's got his ideas. And then we have what turns out for us to be a very productive conversation. But at the beginning, I'm going, okay, what do you think? What's your reaction? I mean, do you like this idea or not? And so if you are real holistic and you're working with somebody who's meticulous, you have to understand the differences, and vice versa, between the way you process and prepare information, which basically means taking your thoughts and getting them out there. Your communication personality is not something that you can prepare. It is who you are. Some of us are very animated. I'm sure some of you have been told the same thing I've been told all my life. Bet you couldn't talk if we tied your hands behind your back. So we're very animated. We have a lot of body language and such like that. Controlled people, which is the opposite, make the most of their authority. They're composed. They are confident within the material that they're presenting, but they're not always paying enough attention to the audience and to be able to see where they are with it. It is very easy for a more animated person to kind of gloss over the important details, because if you're animated, you can fall into the trap of style over substance, and that's never good. And then the last element is how you relate to people, whether I'm going to unmute myself. And are you collaborative? So you really like to work with people. You like to work in a team. Your personal warmth is a big part of how you relate to people. Others are more independent. They prefer to work on their own rather than necessarily work in a team. They're very independent. They're very consistent. But sometimes that can lead others to think that you're being aloof and maybe a little disconnected. None of these are right or wrong. What they are elements of our being that are hardwired in. And if you're not aware of kind of how you do this communication stuff, you may not be taking advantage of some of the real virtues that you have inherently and innately in your personality. In the book, we have what we call kind of a guidebook at the end of each of the chapters, talking about where you communicate in meetings, your personal brand, how you cope with anxiety, all those sorts of kinds of topics. And at the end of each one of them, we have this guidebook that looks at the 2 dimensions and the 5 dimensions, the 2 sides of each, and talks about if you're meticulous, you're likely to do this and it's going to work for you, but you may want to watch out for these sorts of things. We encourage anybody who reads the book to look at all of those, not just your own, because one of the things that's really important is to, with credibility, is to understand the people you're working with. It is very dry at 8,000 feet. So we think that you want to, when you read the book, you want to look at these things and think about yourself. Now, although the assessment is kind of bimodal, you may come out sort of in the middle on some of the dimensions. And that means that you've got a little bit of each. And when you are one or the other is probably situational. So you might want to, if you come out there, think about when are you more on one side versus the other. Any questions or comments about that? Strike you, it makes sense? Strike you as something that hadn't thought about? All right. Then let's dive into credibility capital. We think that credibility is like a ledger. It's an asset and debit comparison, and we add to our credibility by our competence, our reputation, if you will, your personal brand, which I have to say because Sasha is in this call. And but all of the elements that go into how people see you is your credibility. And you can build your credibility, but it's like the old line that, at least in the US military, is you can have 100 kudos and one doggy caca is going to get rid of all of that. And so you want to make sure that you are building your credibility capital. It's your trustworthiness, it's your competence, it's your believability, it's your consistency. All of those things go into building your credibility capital. We think that communication effectiveness is grounded in credibility. And we think it's something that people don't think very much about and take for granted. Now, there's something really important about this notion of credibility capital. And it's one of the other linchpins to our philosophy, our point of view around communication, which is, we've all heard the line, perception is reality, right? That what we perceive is what we hold to be true. In this world today, there are a lot of realities out there, but we think that that's putting the cart before the horse, because we don't think what's important is your perception of reality. We think what's important is their perception of reality, and they are your stakeholders. And we use that word pretty broadly because I don't like the word audience, because audiences are passive. They just sort of sit there and get whatever you're putting out. They have a few ways of participating. They can applaud, they can throw a tomato, but it's really a broadcast mode if you are talking with an audience. Stakeholders, on the other hand, are everyone who has a stake in what you are trying to achieve, including the people who are going to push back at you. So what we say is their perceptions are your reality. Your credibility lives in their perceptions. And so you have to be very conscious of and aware of their, if you will, credibility, their perceptions of your credibility. One of the major elements that goes into this notion of perception and reality is one of the basics that we talk about around communication, which is language. And we tend to take language for granted in the sense that we think we all know what something means. In communication theory, this is very light. Communication is the creation of meaning in the mind of another. Successful communication is creating shared meaning. So if I tell a story about a dog and I don't bother to describe the dog, either their breed, their size, or whatever, if I said a strange dog jumped on me today, first of all, what do I mean by strange? One I never saw before, or something a little weird. Or what do I mean by dog? Because in English, there's no such thing as dog. Size of dogs, breeds of dogs, all of those elements of dogs. And so it would be something if it was a little tiny dog that, was all cute and fluffy, or a Rottweiler. So we have to be aware that what language does is create reality. And so if you're looking at the future, for example, normally I would ask, but I think it'll be a little too difficult, but I would ask people, if I ask you what's the future, what does that mean to you? And that, and somebody will say, next year, 5 years. I did a lot of work with the US Navy. It would be 7 years, 5 months, and 3 days, and that would be retirement. For a lot of us, the future was after COVID. But the interesting thing about the future is the future is now. Future is now. Future is now. So how come your meeting tomorrow doesn't feel like the future? Or what you're going to do next weekend doesn't feel like the future? So I am an almost 20-year breast cancer survivor of a very serious breast cancer. So I was in treatment for a long time. But when I was first diagnosed, I was very upset because I had 5 trips planned, some work, some pleasure, some both. I was looking forward to all of them. And it was clear that they were going to have to get canceled. And I was really upset because I was going to lose my frequent flyer miles. But I had slightly more, serious problems to worry about. But what I realized out of that, and this was my big aha moment, is the future started when my planner ended. So this was a long time ago. I had a Palm Pilot. If it was in the Palm Pilot, it wasn't the future, it was real. The trip that was 2 months away, the trip that was 4 months away, they had mass because I had put language around them. I had written them down. I had visualized them. This is why that vision thing is so important, because that's what creates the future for people. And shared vision of the future is really powerful when we're all sort of pulling in the same place. But you have to remember that it isn't real. It doesn't exist. What's in your calendar for tomorrow is just a bunch of just a bunch of characters on your computer. Not on a piece of paper because nobody uses paper calendar anymore, except my husband. So you want to think about the language that you use. I have 3 daughters that are my husband's. And I got them when they were in their 20s. So I didn't really parent them. I wasn't really a stepmother. But it really bothered me to introduce them as my husband's daughters, because that takes me out of the equation. I love these girls. I've had them for 36 years. And so I finally solved my own dilemma, which, by the way, I want you to know nobody else cares about. But to me, it matters because I believe words create reality. I refer to them as my daughters by marriage because they are a part of my relational being. And so when you use language, pay attention to it. Think about what it might mean to the other person. And that's part of how their perception is your reality. Any questions or comments on that? That's a little philosophical for today's conversation, but I think it's an important grounding. No comments?
Hi, it's Eli.
Eli, yes.
Yes, I can
Ellie,
I can totally relate to your comments that everything you put on the calendar becomes a reality. When you plan trips 6 months ahead of time, a year ahead of time, all of a sudden, all that time now is living with the anticipation and planning of that event. So they do influence your present in a big meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of disappointments, haven't there, in the last 2 years over trips that were planned. And my sister just came back from a fabulous cruise where she said, the cruise was real safe. Everything was fine. Montreal, U.S. Customs was a disaster. And she and her husband 2 days later had COVID. So that's one of the, we're all sort of wondering about that piece of our reality, right? So that was a good point. And the same thing applies with work, right? No matter what your job is, you're working on some kind of project that will come to fruition at a time to be determined, right?
Yep.
It's not finished, it's not built, it's not conceptualized. Our book is not written. But we behave as if it is something you can see, touch, feel, taste, and smell. That's just the way it is. Water's wet, rocks are hard, and that's just how it is. But you need to be aware of it to harness the power of the language and the power of creating a shared vision of the future. And I don't think people think about that enough. The next foundational element that I want to talk about, because it's really one of my favorites, is communication culture within organizations. Now, while this book is individual, and you can certainly take a lot of it, yeah, I mean, it's focused on work, basically. You'll find that a lot of the elements within here apply to your personal lives as well. But one of the things that you want to be thinking about within your organization is communication culture. Now, there's a lot of conversation about organizational culture. It gets studied by academics, it gets studied by consultants. Companies bring in highly paid people from a variety of the big consulting firms to help them improve their organizational culture. When there's a merger, there's lots of conversation about merging these cultures, which is rarely successful. But we keep trying because that's the nature of the beast. But there isn't enough, in our opinion, discussion of communication culture as its own thing. It'll get incorporated into bits and pieces of when you look at organizational culture. But we believe that communication is at the center of organizations. Because if you think about it for a moment, CEOs, vice presidents, unit, division presidents, all of the leadership, basically believe that they have lots of levers to move to achieve organizational results and success. There's financial levers, there's R&D levers, there's human resource levers, hiring the right people, paying them the right amount of money and such. There's sales, there's marketing. There are all these levers that they believe they have at their fingertips in order to be able to help drive the organization to achieve results. I would argue that they really only have one lever, because you can't move any of those other levers without communication. And ironically and unfortunately, that one lever is rarely considered or even acknowledged. And where this will show up in the organization is in how communication culture is embedded in the organization. And we look at it in a 2x2, because you always have to have a 2x2 chart, right? There always has to be a 2x2. Our 2x2 looks at the communication culture on two axes, obviously, transparency and impenetrability, meaning how transparent is the communication culture? How impenetrable is it? You really can't get through to information. Might as well be, locked up in a great big safe, hidden away in some big mountain. And on the other axis, we look at, is communication restrictive? In other words, only certain people get certain information, or is it integrative, meaning that it is it integrates people in mass, if you will, within the organization into the communication sharing. And as you look at these, you start to think about what that means within the organization. As a communication scholar, and a practitioner, I do believe that there are certain kinds of cultures that are going to be more effective than others. But the truth is, it kind of doesn't matter what your culture is, as long as you tell the truth. So you'll see everything is about transparency now, right? And we need to be transparent with our stakeholders, with our employees. But if you are what we consider to be um, a, um, a controlling culture. It's one of the 8 descriptors that we have. If you're a controlling culture, which means that it's pretty impenetrable and it's pretty restrictive, information is hoarded, it is protected, it is doled out in very small pieces and only when people really need it in order to get their job done. That may be the kind of culture you need to have if you're a military organization. You've got to have that, but don't pretend that you're transparent, because people can accept what's so. They may not like it. They may choose to go someplace else, but sometimes what people really need to know is that you're telling them the truth. And if you think that you should have this veneer of transparency when really you have a very controlled approach to communication, that will get you into more trouble than just having a controlled culture. Now, it always helps to explain why your culture is what it is and what your expectations are of your people around that. But the ugly truth is most leaders have no idea what their communication culture is. It takes an audit or somebody coming in and looking at the elements to go, okay, yeah. So here's what you're doing. Here's what you say you're doing. And here's what you're really doing. Now let's talk about how you get to where you wanted to be. So you may find the communication culture chapter, rather interesting as you think about what makes sense within your organization, and are you being honest with people about what you really are and why. I mean, a lot of times, frankly, when we work with clients, the leaders have no idea what their culture really is. They don't even have an aspirational culture. It's like, I don't know. I mean, we don't talk about a communication culture because we know that culture in general lives in behavior. It doesn't take too many questions to find out what's really in the underpinning, of that element. So I'm looking at the clock, and so the last thing that I will talk about is what we talk about in what we call the practical advice, becoming that incredible communicator. You want to pay attention to your personal brand. The good news is personal branding is becoming much more of a concept, and it's integrally tied to your credibility. But the truth is, you always have a personal brand. You always have some element of, of credibility. The danger is kind of if you don't fill in that box with what you want that to be, others will do it for you. It'll be out of their interpretation of what, is happening. We have a chapter on storytelling. Storytelling is so important. I think it's always been important. But before we had all of these amazing technological media that enabled us to communicate so broadly, I don't think we thought about it. We had friends from a town a couple hours away over this weekend because it was my birthday. And we were talking, my husband and I were starting to talk about something that was happening. And, and he has like 3 bullet points. And I started to tell, more about it and more about the people and their backgrounds, whatever. And he turned to our friends and says, Rebecca can make a story out of anything. And it's probably true. But what do you expect? My field's communication. But you all know people who can add to the value, the richness of a conversation or a concept or a pitch. And so you want to be thinking about storytelling, both as a way of presenting information, but also as a way of relating with people. So within that chapter, we talk about the archetypes, which I'm not going to go into now, but the archetypes, which started with Jung, are kind of a shorthand for what you want the point of your story or your company, to be. Are you a hero company? Are you a sage? Is it based on intellectual, property and such like that? So those are just a few of the kinds of chapters, that we talk about. Nonverbal communication, communication anxiety. One of my favorite chapters about agendas, hidden and otherwise, which both apply to when you're going to be having a meeting, but also people's agendas, personal, professional, that maybe they're working towards, but it's pretty impenetrable, and they're working sort of underground, and you need to understand those. So there's more to the book, but we don't have time, so you're just gonna have to get it, which is on Amazon, in Kindle, in audio, and in hard copy, believe it or not. All right.
Rebecca, you mentioned the communication within the organization. How do you think COVID impact that? Because it really took everyone by surprise. Work from home, Zoom culture for a very long period of time, right? The beginning was like the next 2 weeks you work from home, and guess what? Oh, it's another 2 weeks. And it wasn't like a decisive moment that you knew you're going to be at home for 6 months or a year and not face to face. And different organization reacted differently, but the communication was a huge factor of it. How do you keep the company spirit? How do you keep the communication lines open? And how do you transform back to face? We see now with Facebook and Google how they're trying to bring people back, and people just don't want to go back.
Yep. So there will be scholars writing about this for the next 50 years. Okay. My partner and I have written a number of articles for Forbes and Fast Company around, the distance workplace, the hybrid workplace, and such like that. What became obvious, I think, is that you had to work at communication in a way that you never had to work at or even think about in the, in the pre-COVID days. One of the things that was obvious, I think pretty quickly, that was lost was that spontaneous communication that happened in the lunchroom, walking across the hall, walking into somebody's office and say, hey, I've been thinking about this. What do you think? Things had to be in the COVID workplace planned. And we don't use the phone anymore, right? Well, I do. I'm a boomer, but none of you do. And part of so everything had to be planned. If I wanted to have a conversation with Sasha, I would, I might have just walked into his office or knocked on the door or caught him in the hall. But now I have to make an appointment and I have to set up a Zoom. And all of a sudden I feel like I have to come in with a presentation or an agenda, as opposed to, hey, I just want to pick your brain a little bit. Some companies, would start the meeting early, say 15. So the meeting's going to start at 10:15, but you call it at 10. And when people come in, you would put them into breakout rooms. And the idea was just to talk. And so it would be that informal conversation you would have, as everybody started to gather for a meeting. For some companies, it worked really well. For others, it seemed too contrived. But you had to think about what you were going to do. So companies tried to have, Friday beer, afternoons, and, bring your own beverage. And it's just, we're just going to talk about things, or how, what are you going to do on the weekend, whatever. It's harder to do in Zoom. So I think companies are going to move more toward hybrid workplaces. If they can't bring everybody back, then they're going to find days or times or some such that sorry, I looked at chat because I wanted to see if there was a question there. I should not have done that. Bad move. Bring everybody in on the fourth Monday of every month, or if you have a work unit, everybody's in the office on Wednesday. I think they're going to try to have literally a hybrid where people are getting to do work from home and be remote, and the advantages of that, and try not to lose what you have when you're face to face. It has not been solved. It is a work in progress, which is why I say, read an academic article in 5 years and they'll tell you, what the conclusions were. I think for it to work, the leaders in the organization need to have a lot of empathy. They have to be very creative. They have to decide what is the result that they want to achieve, or the result that they're not achieving, and have employees understand that. And apply that as evenly as possible, which, as we all know, is going to be more difficult. There are going to be some people just have to be in the office 5 days a week. So I didn't give you much help, Ellie, but be as creative as you can. Here's the secret to communication, people. You throw a lot of spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. So you have to be willing to experiment. And you have to be willing to say, hey, we're going to try something and see how it works. You have to have feedback mechanisms from your staff, your employees, your stakeholders. And you have to be willing to say, oops, that's not working. We're not doing it anymore, but here's why. Here's what we got from it, and here's what we didn't get from it. So we're going to keep what we got from it, and we're going to try this other thing to add on to it. All too often in organizational change, companies don't explain why we're not doing the old thing anymore, we're doing this new thing. Rather than looking at it as a continuum, which is pushing us higher and higher and saying, we did this thing, we got this much out of it, and then we kind of stagnated. We don't want to lose what we got, but now what we're going to try to do is see if we can't, increase our direction by adding this other thing. Where that really shows up is in quality programs, right? We did continuous improvement, and we did continuous measurable improvement. Then we did Six Sigma. Then we did Lean Six Sigma. Then we did, I don't know even what else. And each time it was just, okay, yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing this next. You do that too often and your employees are going, hey, I can outlast you. Because I know there's no stickiness to any of this. That's not good. Anybody else have an idea, a thought, a reaction? I was a professor for a lot of years. I expect feedback.
You mentioned a new book that you're working on. Is that going to be an Incredible Communication Part 2 or a completely new topic?
It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be about incredible strategic communication. avoiding the pitfalls and failures that happen with communication in organizations. So it can be a little more of an organizational level, with a little bit of culture thrown in, a little bit of strategy, thrown in, but how you either manage when the doggy caca has hit the fan, or how you avoid getting some of those things. A lot of case studies within it. Elon Musk has been very good to us. He is providing many a case study where, because we're Americans and we're sort of grounded in American communication, it'll have some of, focus there, but we're going to try to see if we can't get something global as well. You get into a little bit of trouble sometimes when you try to, talk about another culture that you're not embedded in. But if any of you have some really great examples of communication failures or missteps, or great, communication, send them to me.
And the book is due out when?
Oh, we are still in the proposal stage. So we're still creating it. This book just came out in March, and we discovered that you can't work on a second book when you're in the publicity stage of your previous book. So now we're just getting started. So, it'll be a couple of years. We learned that. We started our book in March of 2020, and it came out in March of 2022. So we're learning that the publication process, we published with Bloomsbury, whose claim to fame was the Harry Potter series. Unfortunately, we are not the new J.K. Rowling, but we've learned a lot about the book publishing process, and so we will utilize that. But I'm afraid you're going to have to wait. But Incredible Communication is a consulting firm, and we're available. Have passport, will fly. I have mishpucha in all over Israel, so just in case. Next.
All right,
Are they always this quiet?
Every once in a while. But I would like to say, if I heard correctly, it was your birthday this past weekend. Is that correct?
It was.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. It was the 50th anniversary of my 21st birthday.
I love it. Wonderful. Well, on behalf of Paul Merage and the Merage Institute, thank you so much for taking the time to enlighten our Merage tribe. And Ellie, as always, thank you for putting together such an amazing Merage talk. And our guests, thank you for joining. I hope you guys all have a wonderful week.
And thank you again for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.